So welcome back, and welcome to you as well. Welcome to all of you out there too. Just as a note, I did talk to Lisa Schlaff, and we are going to make up that session that we missed the following week. So we're going to have this week, and then we're going to have 2 more weeks to come because we missed that session last week due to snow. What's that? School started at 10, so everything was chaotic and a mess, and actually was the right move in terms of, the weather wasn't so bad by 10 or even by 9, but it was the right move at the time, I think. So this is session 2. Last week we covered from the mid-1400s up to 1648, and we're going to do a quick recap of that just to make sure everyone's on the same page. This week we're going to start at that same point, and we're going to go up to 1815. It's the end of the Napoleonic Wars into the Congress of Vienna. So just as a recap, right, from last time, we said that there are new ways of thought, new religious ideas that have spread through Europe, some of them because just out of natural forces and out of development, some of them because of the loss of Constantinople and scholars fleeing and the Renaissance starting, some of it because of the discovery of the New World and this feeling that the New World blows everyone's mind. But we have these new religious ideas, they spread through Europe. Because there are new ways of disseminating information, like the printing press, then a lot of these things are picked up very quickly. We said that results in a series of wars of religion that devastates Central Europe and even frighten the participants. Right? Even the victims are kind of terrified by what just happened. And then also that as time goes on, that these wars became more political. And we sort of made that culminate. We said that ends up with France, which itself is attacking Calvinists in France, is being run by a Catholic cardinal, by Cardinal Richelieu, jumps in on the side of the Protestants against the Holy Roman Emperor, because of politics, because he doesn't want to be surrounded by a powerful Holy Roman Empire and a powerful Kingdom of Spain, both being ruled by the Habsburgs. And so these participants eventually go and they sign this thing called the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, and they don't realize it at the time, but it guarantees sovereignty for all states, I think no matter how big or small, and that's important because there are 300 some odd states in the Holy Roman Empire that basically all kind of gain their own independence. And it gives states a monopoly on the use of force. And we're going to get into that in just a moment. But the idea is that nobles no longer have their own armies, or are supposed to have their own armies, that it's really supposed to be the state has an army and things are run on the state level. And that's going to have impacts as that gets accepted, and it doesn't all get accepted right away, but as that sort of becomes the de facto state in Europe and in the world, that's sort of how we get to a system very much like what we have today. So let's get back to France. It's 1649, right? It's 1 year basically after this war ends. France has extricated itself from this war that it has basically won. The Holy Roman Empire is a mess. There are many, 300 plus states that now make up the Holy Roman Empire, and each one of those is sort of quasi-independent, and so there's no worry about what the Habsburgs might do. But in France, the nobles stage one last rebellion. Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu had been busily taking their power and taking away private armies and so on, all through the first half of the 1600s. They both die in 1643. Louis XIV is a child king, and the nobles, as the 30 Years' War winds down, stage one last rebellion to try and maybe regain some of the power. They basically do it, they claim that they are rebelling on behalf of the king. At the time, the king basically has two people functioning as his regents. One is his mother, which sounds, what's the problem with his mother being his regent? Well, she's Austrian, and doesn't that sound, isn't that a terrible thing? If you're French. And the other one is Cardinal Mazarin, which sounds lovely in French, but it's really originally Mazzarini. It's really originally an Italian name. And so the nobles basically say, we have these foreigners running our country, and we're going to rebel. That's put down. And the result is that Louis XIV, as he grows up and as he rules, and Louis XIV officially is going to be king for 70 plus years. The first 15 or so years is while he's a child, but he's going to practically rule for more than 50 years in his own rights.
How old is he
when he takes the throne?
When he takes reign, yeah.
I believe, I want to say he's 5.
Oh, so he's older, so he's like 20 when he really...
Right, he's like 20 when he really... And the cardinal, he's older.
Does he dismiss them or does he kill them?
He dismisses them. But he basically is heavily influenced by this, and he wants to make sure that there is the state. And for him, the state means him. We're going to see, that's actually one of the things Westphalia pushes against, and we're going to see that start to fade away by the end of his reign. That really, right, l'état c'est moi, right, I am the state, is actually, that's one of his sort of taglines. It's actually not going to be true to some degree by the time he ends his reign. But his objective is to say there is one power, it is here, he moves it to Versailles out of Paris, but it is here in or near Paris. And nobles, you don't have any rights anymore, right? And so very famously, he brings everyone to Versailles, brings all the nobles to Versailles, and instead of power coming from living on your lands and having your own army, suddenly power comes because you are in the king's favor, and you are living at Versailles. And so he basically transforms France over this period of time. There's really only one power center in France, and it's going to be in Versailles, and if you want power, that's where you go. The state is sovereign. There are no subgroups, sub-powers. The powerful nobles might get some wealth from their land, but they don't live there. They don't have a connection to the people. They don't have a connection to be able to rebel. They certainly aren't transacting foreign policy on their own. They aren't starting wars with anybody the way that nobles had over European history. And so he really centralizes, he says the state is the center, the only path to power. And that's how things get set up in France in the wake of Westphalia, and this sort of helps to maintain Westphalia because, again, he's sort of making good on that idea that if you want to interact with the state, you interact with the government, which for him is himself. You don't interact with this noble or that noble. You don't go to, this province and try and get them to cut a trade deal. You go to the state and the state cuts a trade deal. The state declares war. The state has the armies. and nobles don't. So that's what's going on in France. And we're going to get back there in just a moment. But I want to take a break because we've been totally ignoring England, and England is going to be a very important part of our story. England doesn't really participate in the 30 Years' War. They're busy. They're busy with their own sort of war of sort of religion, sort of politics. The Stuart family has been butting heads with Parliament, and it kicks off a civil war in the 1640s. And Charles I, who is the king at the time, ends up in a civil war against certainly the House of Commons and most famously Oliver Cromwell. Charles is eventually arrested, agrees to submit to Parliament, breaks that release, raises an army again, and Parliament defeats him a second time and decides to put him on trial. And this is sort of a shocking thing, because how can you put a king on trial? What are you putting him on trial for? So the actual set of speeches is very famous. There's a rather wonderful, heavily biased very much of its time, but rather wonderful film called Cromwell in the early 1970s with Richard Harris as Cromwell and Alec Guinness as Charles I. Where they dramatize a significant portion of this trial. But what I want to focus on is actually a text that I have up here, and I also have on our sheets in front of us, which is a text from Charles I's trial, and it's a text from the judge, who is going to frame his understanding of the relationship between the king and his people, between the king and the state, and the people and the state. So if we take a look, right, he says there is a contract and a bargain made between the king and his people. And your oath is taken, and certainly, sir, the bond is reciprocal. For as you are the liege lord, so they liege subjects. This we know, the one tie, the one bond, is the bond of protection that is due from the sovereign. The other is the bond of subjection that is due from the subject. Sir, if this bond be once broken, farewell sovereignty. Right? So there's this bond, there's this commitment from the king to his people. And if that's broken, then the entire system is broken, and you don't have a right to rule anymore. Right? Your sovereign right goes up in smoke. Right? These things may not be denied, sir, whether you have been, as by your office you ought to be, a protector of England, or the destroyer of England. Let all England judge, or all the world, that hath looked upon it. And the reason why I really like this text, the reason why I think it speaks to what we're talking about so much, is that this is one of the first times, it's one of the best articulations of this idea, that the king isn't the state. Right? Because one of the other changes we said comes out of Westphalia in 1648. One of the other things that happens differently after 1648 is that the king as a person is different from the king as a ruler. The king as a person can give his inheritance when he dies to whoever he wants. Give some to one child, some to another. He can give some to a cousin who he particularly likes, right? Here's some lovely jewels, here's some lovely horses. The king as the ruler doesn't get to do that. And in fact, when the Stuart dynasty in England ends, very famously after Queen Anne, later on, it goes to George I, who's from Hanover, doesn't actually speak any English, And even though he is the ruler of Hanover, he's the Elector of Hanover, and he becomes king in England, those two titles never merge, right? Because even though he is the ruler of both, he's the ruler of both, they're not his personal property. And so, for basically the whole 18th century, you have the king as both King of England and Elector of Hanover. And eventually, when Queen Victoria takes the throne in the 1800s, Hanover doesn't recognize women rulers, and those two titles split. Right? Whereas if it was a personal inheritance, then okay, so combine the two and be done with it. Right? But we aren't in a state anymore where a state, right? States are no longer personal playgrounds for nobles and rulers. They're their own thing, they're their own entity. Right? The king has a bargain with the state, he's not the state. And I think that's also one of these important things to come out of Westphalia. And Judge Bradshaw, I think, is sort of saying that, is saying, you're a protector of England or a destroyer of England, but that's because you have a contract with the people. Right? Not because you inherited England and it's your personal playground and you do with it what you want, the way you would do what you wanted with a castle. You have a responsibility. This is an office you hold. It's not your personal property. And as the Enlightenment goes on, we start to see more of these ideas. These are two of our Enlightenment philosophers. We have Thomas Hobbes, and we have John Locke. The kind of governments they're going to desire are not totally opposite, are pretty much opposite. So we're still in the 1600s, we're in 1650, early 1650s for Hobbes, and we're in 1689 for Locke. The kinds of governments they're going to want are totally different. Hobbes is going to say, everyone's out there to kill you, you need an absolute monarchy. Locke is going to say, no, we have the right to life, to liberty, and to property. Jefferson later on thinks that sounds a little trite, and so changed it to pursuit of happiness. And Locke very much is interested in a limited monarchy, maybe even a republic, but mostly in a limited monarchy. But they both agree on one thing. I don't know if, would anybody like to read, or do you want me to keep reading? You can keep reading, it's fine. Okay. Right, so Hobbes says, right, the only way to erect such a common power is to confer all their, that is the people's, power and strength upon one man, or upon one assembly of men, that they may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices unto one will. So where do you get the right to rule? You get the right to rule from the people. Right, he's framing what Judge Bradshaw said in Charles's trial. Hobbes is saying there's this bargain that the people make, right, which is as much to say to appoint one man or assembly of men to bear their person, and everyone to own and acknowledge himself to be the author of whatsoever he that so beareth their person shall act, or cause to be acted, right? You made this choice. You decided everyone has to accept that they agree that the ruler is the ruler, that they give up their rights to the ruler, and they're responsible for his ruling. What's odd is that Bradshaw and Hobbes are on totally opposite sides. Bradshaw is one of the leaders of this rebellion, is one of the leaders of the House of Commons, is the man who ultimately helps make that decision to execute Charles. Hobbes is off at this point in France, tutoring the future Charles II. So they are on completely opposite sides, right? Hobbes is saying to Charles II, you're going to be king one day, which He is. And here's your responsibility. And Bradshaw is saying to Charles I, Charles II's father, we're going to execute you because you didn't accept that you were doing this on behalf of the people, right? You thought you were doing this on behalf of God or because you inherited it. You don't get that. That's not the case. You're doing this for the people. It's interesting. Hobbes doesn't actually invent this idea. Like we saw, it's already there in England, and he's actually really pulling it from Rome. Right? He's very famously, the Romans had a saying, right? The Senate and the Roman people. And actually, a couple sentences, I didn't want to put too much text here, but a couple sentences later, he starts talking about civitas, right, as the people, just sort of almost in a Roman context. But so in England, we have this very clear distinction. The king might have the right to rule. The king might be an absolute monarch, might have every right in the world, or almost every right in the world, but he gets it from the people. Right? And the people, in some way, are the state. And Locke very clearly says this. He says, wherever, therefore, any number of men are so united into one society as to quit every one his executive power of the law of nature and to resign it to the public, there only is a political or civil society, right? If you live with other people, I give up my natural rights, at least some of them. You give up yours, you give up yours, you give up yours. And we all together say we're going to have a government. And that's where government comes from. This isn't actually where government comes from, right? I mean, this is all political theory, right? Government probably came from somebody who had, the biggest stick who, attacked their people, right? I mean, this is not originally where government comes from. This is the idea of social contract theory. This is, in theory, where government comes from. Ideally, where government should come from. Right? That wherever any number of men in the state of nature enter into society to make one people, one body politic under one supreme government, or else when anyone joins himself to and incorporates with any government already made, right? Not a problem. For hereby he authorizes the society, right? He gives up his rights. He authorizes the society, or which is all one, the legislator thereof, to make laws for him, right? He gives his rights to the legislature to make laws, right? He says, I'm giving this up. And now the country, the state, is going to act on behalf of the society. So we have Louis XIV in France, who is saying the government is centralized. And in England, where the government was already a little bit more centralized, they agree with that and they take it one step further and they're saying the king is not the state. There is the state, and the government of the state is what's in charge. And that government is who you deal with. That government is who has the right to power. And that's really, really proven when the two of them get into a war. Right? For most of the 18th century, most of the 1700s, England and France are either fighting with each other or preparing to fight with each other. The first of those big wars is a war called the War of the Spanish Succession, which has, I have a family tree up here. It's a little bit of a spaghetti factory. You have no need to read through it to try and understand what is going on. The upshot of this war is the King of Spain, who's conveniently here in the middle in red, dies. He has no sons. He has no brothers. And suddenly there's a problem. Because either way you go, any which way you go, you're going to pass through a female line, which wasn't so accepted in Spain at this point. And if you go one way, if you go up to his father and then down to his nephew, half-nephew, you get Louis XIV's son as the rightful king of Spain. And if you go in the other direction, you go up to his grandfather and come back down to his first cousin, you get the Holy Roman Emperor as king of Spain. And so either way, right, there are powerful people who want this to happen. And so basically all of Europe ends up in a war to try and decide who gets to be the next king of Spain. Eventually, and this is sort of a very odd way of thinking of it or framing of it, the side fighting against France wins, and Louis's grandson becomes king of Spain. You say, well, what does that mean? How is it possible that the side fighting against France wins, and Louis's grandson becomes king of Spain? Well, the side fighting against France puts in a particular new term. They say, you can have Louis XIV's grandson as king of Spain, but he can never also be king of France. They have to be separate people. And that means that you can't go and do this whole, oh, well, I have this possession, I have that possession, and now they're really one possession. Right? So this is the first time where not only England, but basically they essentially force the French into accepting that you can have a Bourbon king in France and a Bourbon king in Spain, but it's not a family possession. Right? They can't be the same person. And so here too, we're again seeing that idea where the two things are split, right? Where the rulership is not the same as a family inheritance, right? Where the state is an independent entity, where it's not the personal playground of the ruler. Because you can't combine, right, Spain and France. This also makes, by the way, just as a side note, this is going to make England vastly more powerful. Spain and France both give up various territories overseas, and this is sort of how England starts getting things like Gibraltar, for example, that are going to allow it to dominate the world later on, even when it doesn't actually occupy large swaths of territory. So again, the upshot here is that it's not about family anymore, it's not about inheritance. It's about there's a king of Spain and he's king of Spain, and there's a king of France and he's king of France, and we're not going to let you try and combine the two and make a kingdom of Spance or Frayne or whatever, these are separate things.
But it is inherited in the sense that they had to go through the bloodlines.
Yes.
Defined. So the title is still an inheritance.
Absolutely.
What you do with it is, what they've done is they've changed the political side, but the bloodlines are still inherited.
Right. The bloodlines are still inherited, and actually each state also kind of gets to design, and this is part of the, you don't interfere, at least in theory, with other states. You don't get to necessarily change the way that inheritance works, right? And so even though, again, we said that George I over in England is also going to be Elector of Hanover, right? Well, but George I of Hanover becomes King of England, right? That they're separate things, and when Queen Victoria takes the throne in England, the Hanoverians, the people in Hanover, say, yeah, we don't let women rule, and so it's not Queen Victoria who's going to rule, it's going to be someone else, and they sort of have to accept, right, and that splits. Ironically, this Bourbon family, the one that becomes King of Spain, is actually the only one that still, right, is one of the few, or one of those European monarchies that still exists. The French line, of course, gets wiped out, or loses power, certainly, I should say, after the French. Right, they lose their heads, the king's brother survives eventually, but But that line loses power in France, and the only Bourbons ruling are actually the Spanish ones. And they come back after Franco. All right, so we keep going through the 18th century, through the 1700s, and we keep having these wars between between France and England. The 7 Years' War is actually the First World War. It's fought in India, it's fought in North America, we know it as the French and Indian War. It's fought really all over the world as these two sides are vying for domination. The result of this is that England wins a decisive victory, right? The French are really, they lose a bunch of possessions in North America, they lose all their possessions in India, and this sort of sets the French on this burning desire for revenge.
Hasn't changed.
Well, it certainly doesn't for a number of decades. About a decade after that 7 Years' War ends, we have the American Revolution, and France gets into it. And we know this, of course, if you've studied American history. The picture over there, over here on the left, is the Marquis de Lafayette, who is an 18-year-old, comes in and sort of turns the entire thing on its head. This is actually a famous painting. You can't really see the flags, but it's supposed to be the Battle of the Chesapeake, which is the only naval battle that France wins against England for like 200 years, roughly speaking. But it's the battle that allows Washington to win at Yorktown. France expends a tremendous amount of money, a tremendous amount of resources. This is going to in part lead to the French Revolution because they go into so much debt to fight this war where they don't really gain anything. But the weird question here, the question that I think really needs to be asked for us, is why is France involved in the first place? Now we know revenge, okay, that's an obvious motivator. But we said one of the terms of the Peace of Westphalia is that you don't interfere in what's going on in someone else's land, right? Each state is sovereign. And so if a king wants to attack Lutherans somewhere in his own land, or Calvinists somewhere, or Jews somewhere, that king has that right. And that, with Westphalia, you're not supposed to mess around with that. So this question, well, okay, why is France, what right, if France thinks it's upholding the system, and by 1778, France does think it's upholding the system, what right does France have to interfere? So this is actually where we get sort of the reason why Westphalia is going to need its first big alteration. Right? The goal of Westphalia was to stop any massive war like what had happened in the 30 Years' War from ever happening again. Right? We said that's why it happens, because everyone is afraid of what happened in the 30 Years' War. What France does, though, is it waits, and once it thinks, after the Battle of Saratoga, that the U.S. has a good chance of winning this war, France basically says, yeah, we recognize the American government. It's a new state. It's not English territory anymore. And now that we recognize there's a state, well, it's a sovereign state, and we can do the same thing we do with every other sovereign state. We can make treaties, we can make alliances, we can send troops to aid them if they ask for help. And this is going to be one of those important things that we're going to see, that the loophole, the way that states first get around that issue of sovereignty, the way they first sort of break the Peace of Westphalia, and it's going to require a sort of a fix that we're going to see later on, is that basically you say, yeah, your government isn't legitimate anymore. Or there's a new government in part of your territory, and you thought you controlled this all, but it's not really yours anymore. Because it's not yours, now we can interfere. To some degree, this is directly right where the idea that we can sort of take action in Venezuela today, right? This is in the news right now, right, with the leader Maduro, who's in control of Venezuela right now. The idea that we can maybe overthrow him, maybe lend aid to forces that are fighting against him, comes from this concept. You're not the legitimate government anymore. We're talking to the legitimate government. We can help the legitimate government, right, of this region, right? The legitimate government of America is that thing that's meeting by this time in Philadelphia, and they run away and then come back. But right, the thing that's that Continental Congress, that's the legitimate government of America here, right? And so it's what France says. And therefore, England, you might be claiming it still, but we don't recognize that claim anymore, right? We're going to help out the true leaders. So it's a way of getting rid or getting around that sovereignty sort of piece of the Peace of Westphalia. The problem for France is that they get nothing from this. They get some nice revenge. England loses. England is terribly embarrassed. And America basically then decides to go its own way and do its own thing. And meanwhile, France is horrifically in debt. And so, a decade or so later, they're going to have a revolution of their own. I've given you this kind of wonderful painting where you have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And we're going to take a look at this, not the actual text, but we're going to talk about this in just a second. We have, it seems to be, the painting is made in 1789. This sort of very bombastic thing with the king freeing France, or a ruler freeing, France is freed. We have an angel, and we have the eye of providence looking over. God wants this thing to happen, which, given what we sort of know about the French Revolution and the fact that it turned sort of very anti-religious later on, is sort of fascinating. But what's so important is that the first official declaration, their equivalent of the Declaration of Independence, and if you ever read, I didn't give you the text, but if you ever read it, it reads like the Declaration of Independence, with some influence from Rousseau as well as Locke. Because it is like the Declaration of Independence, it's not only the equivalent, it's co-written by Thomas Jefferson. So of course it sounds similar. Because he's in France at this point, he helps write the Declaration, and then he leaves to come back to the US and become, shortly thereafter, the Secretary of State. The name of the Declaration is
Declaration of the Rights of Man.
the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It's you can't really see it, right? Exactly. And so the point here is that this is the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen. But what's the difference?
Individual and society.
Individual and society, that there is a state, that it is made up of citizens, right? That citizens, the people of the state, have special rights. And this whole idea of citizenship, as it is in the US, becomes a very big thing. And there are debates, well, are Jews citizens or are Jews not citizens? Right? Are Jews Frenchmen or are they not Frenchmen? Of course, absolutely, it's still going on. But it's a debate in the National Assembly, and the decision at the time is, yes, Jews are Frenchmen, and Napoleon reaffirms that status. But this idea, the idea that it's the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the citizen, that citizens have special, extra rights, is again sort of this link of you have the state and you have its people. Right, and the people are linked to the state, and the state favors its people above others, right? That it's a separate entity. That idea that we saw way back when we sort of said, You get this sort of almost pre-nationalism at the end of the 100 Years' War, when France is France and England is England. So we're getting that here, that you're French. And this is actually really important because we think of France as French, I think. The people of France are French. But in 1789, when this revolution starts, there are over 100 dialects of French that are spoken. There are all these remote, provinces where people don't speak the same French as they do in Paris. And so this is an attempt at welding together a state of France. It's sweeping away those last vestiges of a place that's really ruled by nobles and saying, no, we're all French. Now, for a variety of reasons, France is going to end up in war with the rest of Europe. The initial reason is that the rulers of Austria and Prussia, who are of course related to the King of France, because all the rulers of Europe are related to one another, are very, very nervous at the idea of the king losing his power. So they issue this thing called the Declaration of Pillnitz, where His Majesty the Emperor of Austria and His Majesty the King of Prussia declare together that they regard the actual situation of His Majesty the King of France as a matter of communal interest for all sovereigns of Europe. They hope that that interest will be recognized by the powers whose assistance is called in, that they won't refuse. Right? Together with the aforementioned majesties, the most efficacious means for enabling the French king to strengthen in utmost liberty the foundations of a monarchical government in France. So what does that mean? They're saying that the King of France is being sort of kicked out of power and they have the right to interfere.
Well, those powers and systems are called in.
Right, so the idea here is that all of they're also, remember, the Holy Roman Empire is still like 300 plus states, and so the idea is, okay, so the Emperor of Austria and the King of Prussia are the two big rulers there, but that they're going to bring along the Duke of whatever and the Margrave of somewhere and the Elector of some other place, right? They're going to bring in all these little nobles, or all these little rulers in the Holy Roman Empire, to try and put the King of France into power. Now what's odd is that when this is issued, the King of France is still in power. France is a limited monarchy. They've passed a constitution. And so here, oddly enough, they're saying, we can interfere in your government even though the king hasn't asked for that help. Because we think that maybe there's an illegitimate government holding power over him. And this is going to cause all sorts of problems because it's sort of recognizing but also sort of violating that issue of sovereignty, right? If King Louis XVI says, I'm the king, then what right do Austria and Prussia have to interfere with the situation? Okay. Eventually, of course, the king is killed. We have the radical phase. They're kicked out with the Directory, and eventually we have our friend Napoleon. Now, Napoleon is going to decide to go out and he's going to conquer most of Europe. What I want to draw your attention to is this map over here on my left. This is a map of the Holy Roman Empire pre-French Revolution. When I keep saying there's like 300 plus states, it looks really like a paint spatter. Especially like in this area. Like there's just, this little noble, that little noble, this little ruler, that little ruler.
The red areas?
This is one noble area, this is another, this is another, this is another, this is another. This is a bishopric over here. This is...
What is outside of the Roman Empire?
Good, so the king,
I think
right?
that's easier.
France is outside. Switzerland and these parts of Italy are outside. Hungary, which is really part of Austria, is outside, although it's ruled by Austria. This part of Prussia is outside, although part of Prussia is inside. This part of Poland is outside. And then you have over here what is effectively Belgium and the Netherlands. And then Denmark up here. But all of this paint spatter, these are all individual places. These are all ruled by individual rulers. And so when Napoleon comes sweeping through, well, of course he can come sweeping through. He's got an army that's basically conscripting everyone in France, every able-bodied young man in France. And he's fighting the Margrave of whatever, the Duchy of Württemberg, or the Bishop of Würzburg. And they're bringing an army with 100 men, or 200 men, who are not in the same command structure as the person from the next province over, from the next area over.
So each of them are separate sovereigns?
Yeah.
Even though they're under the...
They're each separate sovereigns.
Even though they're under the rule...
Even though they're in theory under the Holy Roman Empire, they're each separate sovereigns. And so of course Napoleon can sweep across Europe. Right? Europe is... The area that should be able to oppose him is totally disunited, is totally broken up, is not one thing at all. And so he will very quickly, very famously sweep through, take over basically all of Europe, and begin reforming its governments. And that's, for example, the Holy Roman Empire will finally disappear under Napoleon. Prussia had been gobbled up, Poland had been gobbled up by Prussia and Russia and Austria, and it's reintroduced actually by Napoleon. There are various other changes that are made. When Napoleon is finally defeated, Europe turns around and says the same thing that they said after the 30 Years' War. How do we stop that from ever happening again, right? Clearly the system is broken, right? Clearly the things that were set up in the wake of 1648 haven't solved this problem, because we just had a massive war with armies of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men marching all over, right? Napoleon, in the course of 1812, loses a 400,000 man army in Spain, an army somewhere between 400 and 600,000 men in Russia, and that the second army, actually, when I say loses, they die. The one in Spain mostly surrenders. The one in Russia actually dies. And then after he's finally defeated, and he escapes and comes back and fights at Waterloo, he's raised another 400,000 soldier. I mean, these are massive armies all over Europe. And so the Europeans want to sit down and say, okay, we're not getting rid of states. But by this time we are states, right? There's France, and that's France. There's the United Kingdom, which officially starts during this time, and it's the United Kingdom. The King of Prussia is the King of Prussia, and he likes being, right? None of these people want to interfere with that state system. None of these people want to get rid of that state system. What they want to do is prevent any state from ever being able to conquer all of them again. As we know, this is not going to succeed, right? But that's the goal. The goal is to prevent any one of them from ever being able to do that again. And so they sit down at the Congress of Vienna, in Vienna, Austria, and they try to figure out, well, what is the tweak? What's the change we can make to this state system that Westphalia created to prevent anyone from being able to do this again? And their decision, they basically say, we have to have a balance of power, right? The problem is that there are too many small states, giving all these small sovereign states, like you said, like you were saying, the recognition means that if a large power comes along, they can just sweep straight through these little nothings. We have to figure out a way to keep that from happening, and that means we need stronger states. And so they make a number of changes to try and make that happen. They take the Netherlands and they take Belgium, and they smush them together. They don't actually ask the Dutch or the Flemish whether they want this, right? Or they don't ask the Belgians, like, are you interested in being part of the Netherlands? They just say, okay, we're going to create a kingdom of the Netherlands that'll be more able to resist if, say, France decides to go out and invade.
This is being decided
by the big powers in Europe.
Yeah.
Austria, it's in Vienna, right? It's the Times of Vienna. So it's in Vienna, so Austria, Prussia, Russia, the UK, by this time it's the United Kingdom, and eventually France. France will eventually be allowed back to the table. So they create a kingdom of the Netherlands. Now this is
staying in Belgium, they resented.
Oh, absolutely, and this is one of those pieces where it's like, right, the attempt to solve this is, well, let's set up a balance of powers where there will be these different states. They don't ask the people in the states. Part of the other problem is they're scared, right, of republics because of what happened in France. And so they basically sort of say, okay, well, we're going to make sure almost everything is under a monarchy. And the problem is this genie has been let out of the bottle. And so their solution eventually will fall apart as people start revolting, which is not in the equation from Westphalia at all, because people aren't supposed to have power, aren't supposed to be able to use force. Only the state is supposed to be able to use force.
Did they learn that from France, though?
Good, so they actually just try and stuff the genie back in the bottle, say we're going to put in strong kings who can put down rebellions if there are rebellions, and the problem will be solved. So you're absolutely right. This is an attempt at it. It's a failure, and of course, long term, the failure is going to lead us into next week's session, which is going to take us into World War I and World War II. They decide to collapse these states. They don't reestablish the Holy Roman Empire. That's dead. It's been dead. Everyone knows it's been dead, except for the Emperor of Austria, who hasn't admitted it. So they collapse it into 30 states instead of 300. And they also make a German confederation, because they're left in a bind, right? The rest of the states are left in a bind. If you have a Germany, if you have an actual state of Germany, the UK and Russia and France are all kind of terrified that Germany is going to be massively powerful. They're right, by the way.
By the way they turned out.
They're totally right. So in order to prevent that, the one place they don't put in a strong ruler, right, they do collapse those smaller states to try and have slightly stronger rulers, but the one place they don't do that, they say, okay, we're going to make a German confederation. There will be free trade within it, right? You won't have tariffs going from one place to another. And they'll be bound to defend each other, but they won't have one ruler. It's, in some ways, it's a little bit of a preview, you could argue, of the EU, actually, eventually.
Yeah.
And to some degree, that's sort of where part of the idea comes from. The other issue is that you have,
They don't learn from mistakes.
right, you have Prussia and Austria, and both of them have territory outside of the German Confederation, but also a lot of territory inside, and neither one actually wants to give up any control. So the other reason why you end up with a German Confederation and not a state of Germany is that they're trying to balance between Prussia and Austria, who both would probably try and claim the mantle of we're the ruler of Germany. But so the goal is to create this balance of power where, okay, we've seen the failure once, we saw it happen, we saw Napoleon take over all this stuff, well, if we have enough strong states, that won't happen again. Right? It's a tweak to Westphalia, right? yeah, you're still allowed to have small states. Yeah, they're still sovereign, but we're going to try and get rid of a lot of them so that none of them will be so weak. But as we know, and as you've said, that's not going to work.
It doesn't.
And so this tweak doesn't happen. This tweak doesn't take a full effect. It's not successful. And that's what we'll talk about next week. Thank you very much.
There he is.
What's that?